Hi there! This issue of the Indie Corner takes us back in time twice at the same time, into the 2010s and into a version of the 80s that never quite existed. And I'll do so with the seventh studio album by MANDO DIAO. These lot weren't the only ones to jump on the trend of indie rockers suddenly meddling with retro synth sounds and 80s cliches. It all started with an old synth from Russia. How the career path of these Swedish rockers led to that decision, now in a short band bio slideshow.
Mando Diao emerged from a band called Butler, founded in the Swedish town of Borlänge by singer and guitarist Björn Dixgard and keyboarder Daniel Haglund in the mid-90s. Until 1999, the lineup was completed by Gustav Noren as a second singer and guitarist, and then bass player Karl-Johan Vogelklu and drummer Samuel Giers. The meaning of the band name is only fully known to Björn Dixgard, if at all, who claimed that the words had been shouted at him by a man in a strange dream. Björn and Gustav quickly formed a prolific songwriter team, and Mando Diao soon were signed by EMI Sweden on the strength of their songs and live performances. Their debut album, Bring 'Em In, and the raucous single Sheepdog soon made Mando Diao Sweden's hottest rock export of the 2000s, alongside fellow neo-garage rockers The Hives. With a new keyboard player, Mats Björke, Mando Diao recorded their second album, Hurricane Bar, which became their international breakthrough in 2004 and refined their garage rock sound. Their third full-length release, Ode to Ocracy from 2006, brought them even more chart success in Sweden, Germany, and especially Austria. With their fourth self-produced album, Never Seen the Light of Day in 2007, Mando Diao began leaving their established, energy-filled 60s and 70s inspired garage rock sound behind, incorporating also more indie and pop elements, a direction the band embraced fully on their next album. For Give Me Fire, Mando Diao chose two hip-hop musicians as producers, giving their sound a more trendy and commercial appeal. The album focused more on danceable tracks as well as pop and soul influences. Both the songs Gloria and Dance With Somebody received extensive radio airplay and became the band's biggest singles to date. The album itself also was their most successful, reaching the top of the charts in Austria, Germany and Switzerland. For a moment, Mando Diao had arrived in the mainstream. The band followed this wave of popularity with an MTV Unplugged album of acoustic versions of their songs. The next studio release, however, marked an unexpected departure from the mainstream success. Instead of continuing the formula of Give Me Fire, they recorded a collection of old poems by Gustav Fröding entirely in Swedish and set it to intimate music dominated by piano and strings in a kind of indie chamber music. Despite this risky new direction, the resulting album, Infruzet, became Mando Diao's most successful album in Sweden and was the first of theirs to also enter the Norwegian charts. Apparently, having developed a taste for artistic variety, the band's next album marked yet another change in style. After having come across a vintage Russian synthesizer called Aelita, the songwriting and sonic direction of the next album was deeply shaped by its sounds. That seventh album was released in 2014.
The Aelita synthesizer got its name from a character in a Russian sci-fi novel from the 1920s. She's the queen of a kind of communist society on Mars. Well, the band didn't really go deeper into that on their album, but they certainly chose an outlandish cover artwork. So far, I haven't read or heard of anybody not saying that the artwork was confusing, bad taste, and downright ugly. Apparently, the band had planned to create a kind of immersive 3D artwork for digital releases where listeners could, in a kind of virtual reality approach, move through the artwork in 3D. I don't know if they ever realized it, but yeah, this artwork really is quite a challenge for the eyes. And yet it strangely corresponds to the sound within. Black Saturday, the single of the album and also opening track, still acts as a kind of bridge between the band's huge hit Dance with Somebody and the 80s nostalgia that defines this album. It is a racy pop rock song with keyboards and even a guest appearance of Miami Vice theme creator Jan Hammer, who revives this sound with his guitar. However, his part is a very short one and certainly something he could have recorded in his sleep. In fact, there is more wild synth guitar noodling on a later track that sounds even more like Jan Hammer to me. Maybe he was featured on both tracks. As for Black Saturday, it's a very solid single, a rock song for the dance floor. It won't shake the foundations of pop music, but it's fun, despite its rather foreboding lyrics.
It's better than losing, more than life itself. Can you feel it? Another Black Saturday. Another Black Saturday.
Rooftop then fully gets into the 80s synth pop mood that prevails throughout the rest of the album. It is a sweaty synth pop number with the unexpected appearance of a violin. The following Money Doesn't Make You a Man nails that 80s synth rock sound. It is a nocturnal song about jealousy and disappointment with different synth layers. A female background singer adds a bit of soul energy, and overall, this is a good song. On Sweet Wet Dreams, we get a bit of fake Latin guitar and a somewhat European 80s pop flavor, plus disco strings. It is deliberately cheesy in places, but I can't help it. At its core, I think this is a well-made, breezy and nostalgic pop song.
I'm alone. Together with sweet wet dreams. Don't let go, never lose it. Just holding on to wet dreams. Left you because you came too close to me.
If I Can't Have You exchanges the summer sun of a fictitious 1983 summer vacation on an island for the cold neon lights of an oppressive city at night. The Aelita synth chirps and bleeps, but there are also more modern influences from hip hop here and there. A song that sounds as if it had been made for one of the radio stations in Grand Theft Auto. At the end, there is a long guitar synth solo that is the cherry on top. I wouldn't be surprised if it was also by Jan Hammer. The song is actually quite long drawn, with over 6 minutes, and maybe not the strongest tune, but this time around it's the sound that makes the track. This is another successful exercise in recreating a certain sound or the mood of a decade from memory and idealization. Track 6, Baby, sounds even colder by means of a strict programmed beat, high frequency synth sounds, and a vocoder effect. It is a melancholic song, maybe also a bit too repetitive and long for its own good, but it satisfyingly continues that dystopian 80s nighttime atmosphere. It's a decent track in my opinion. Lonely Driver, even though it is lyrically also sad at night, finally brings back some sun rays. It is a very laid back, dream soul pop track with a wonderful melody. There is a great combination of strings and keyboards and smooth bass. Coming to think of it, this is my favorite song on the album. Get into your digital Lamborghini and drive through an 8-bit landscape.
Lonely driver, heading for a pit stop in the night. Lonely driver.
The next one, Child, is another slow, a bit melodramatic and melancholic song. It concentrates on strings and a repetitive piano motif, and this time it definitely goes on a bit too long for my taste and is not as memorable. If this is meant as a soothing lullaby, it is a rather depressing one, because when Björn Dixgard sings "Child, I'm with you all the time, when a shadow falls, I'm with you," one rather gets the impression that he's already surrounded by an army of evil shadows. The next cut is called Romeo. It raises the tempo a bit again. A heavier synth sound gives it a vague dark wave appearance, but other than that, not a lot is happening in this track. It's merely okay. Which brings us to the last entry on Aelita, Make You Mine. This could have inspired the equally nostalgic electronic 80s sounds of the Stranger Things soundtrack. Make You Mine is a bittersweet synth pop tune that sounds quite nostalgic due to the Aelita synthesizer, and yet too modern to be truly 80s. I'd say it's a solid closing track to this stylistic experiment of an album. Aelita, or Aelita, certainly isn't the only token of an indie rock band looking back at the 80s for inspiration. Muse did it, for example. Arcade Fire did it, and even the Scottish twee collective Bell and Sebastian eventually did it. 80s sounds and aesthetics were warmed up almost inflationary in the 2010s, it seemed. Mando Diao's contribution to that trend left a lot of their fans scratching their heads and sensing a bad case of loss of artistic direction. Still, the album reached number one in the band's home country, Sweden, and the top 10 in both Germany and Switzerland. Nonetheless, such deliberately irritating deviations from a band's established sound can damage a fan base and result in a flop with wider reaching impact. For Mando Diao, this indeed seems to have been the case. At least none of the albums after this one were a big success again, and the band really seemed to have alienated a lot of their fans and critics. Keyboard player Mats Björke left the band after the release of Aelita, shortly followed by one half of the songwriter team, Gustav Nore, in 2015. So that also seems to underline that this album even caused a bit of a rift within the band. If I try to look at this album disconnected from the rest of Mando Diao's discography, more as a one-off left field project, I can, however, find a lot to like about this album, apart from the cover artwork. Also, in comparison to the aforementioned bands and the general 80s hype in music that still seems to be ongoing, in my opinion, Aelita is one of the better attempts at creating a kind of electro rock sound that never really existed in that way during the 1980s. Of course, one has to be in the mood for some cheesy elements and also for this ironic approach to sound elements that is, if you listen more closely to the album, actually not that ironic after all. The album has got a few lengths and flaws and remains an odd alternative mainstream album, but an odd one I'm glad I've checked out. Maybe now you also got a little bit of appetite for Aelita, or maybe you already knew it, then let me know your opinions about this album in the comments. Were you disappointed when it came out, or do you think it is a misunderstood little gem? Plenty of questions surrounding this one. Maybe I'll read from you or see you again at the next Murdock Music Minute.